I want to tell the story of my horse named Old Pal. I wrote this up with the company of Jane Ann. I wrote it at a time and season where I was much more verbally talented than I am now. So I'm going to read the words of this story. The spring of 1940 marked the end of an exhausting winter. The wild mustangs on the Utah West Desert were exhausted as well. Many had lost their battle to the elements. To those who had survived, the badge of strength, agility, endurance, and courage was theirs. From this crop of new foals of the previous year came one of the most remarkable animals that I have had the pleasure to know and care for in my life. The mare's name was Old Pal. She was captured in the desert roundup of mustangs and found her way into our corral at the age of 3 years. My brothers Olsen and Snell, plus every teenager in the neighborhood, took turns being bucked off during the process of breaking this new mustang. At last, my brother Alden, who had more animal sense as a teenager than most men have in their lifetime, decided the first thing that should be done is to make friends with this beautiful wild animal. He proceeded to get her hooked on sugar lumps, which she learned to love and which Alden enjoyed providing for her. Eventually, through patience and perseverance, he was able to call her up to the fence by name and feed her sugar lumps. As this relationship grew, Alden even trained her to step up on a log with one foot to receive her sweet reward. It then became an easy transition through much petting and handling to saddle, mount, and successfully ride the newfound friend. For the next 20 years, Old Pal was a member in good standing and of true loyalty to the Olsen family. Old Pal had beautiful markings, which were unusual for mustangs. She had a bay-colored body, black mane and tail, and a spot of white, both on her forehead and on her right rear foot. At maximum weight, Old Pal was only about 800 pounds, but her athletic ability made her the fastest horse in Spanish Fork for the distance of 2 blocks. She met and beat all challengers at this short distance because of her quickness and competitive spirit. Most of my young life, I rode her bareback. She could be ridden with a halter that had been fashioned out of a straight rope. This consisted of the rope being tied around her neck and then being looped over her nose to stop her. Leaning to the right or the left would turn her in either direction. She could be mounted from either side and could be dismounted from either side or the rear end. My father appreciated the special loyalty and intelligence of Old Pal. It was routine for him to ride Old Pal to his favorite hunting spot up Sterling Hollow. This is located on the top of the front mountain on the Spanish Fork Canyon side. He would dismount for daylight to signal the opening of the deer season, shoot his deer, clean it, load it on Old Pal's back. Many times he would have this task completed early on the opening morning of the deer hunt, and rather than return to camp and miss out on the rest of the morning's hunt, he would simply start Old Pal down the trail with the deer on her back, and with a gentle pat from my father, Old Pal would carry the deer back to the base camp and then would contentedly graze in a small meadow until my father would return several hours later. I can hardly believe that. It's true. One time my father let some of his friends borrow Old Pal to go up in the mountains to retrieve a deer they had shot the day before. By the time the deer was located and loaded on, it was after dark, and it was also raining heavily. As they proceeded down the steep and treacherous place on the trail, Old Pal was forced off a cliff into a timber and rock-strewn ravine far below. It was the judgment of these men that there was no way that this horse could be alive, and besides, they were wet and cold, and so they decided to walk down the mountain and leave her behind. The next day, my brothers Alden and Snell hiked up the mountain to see what had happened to their beloved pony. Upon arriving at the spot described by our friends, they could see the place where old Pal had fallen over the cliff, but she was nowhere to be found. They studied the ground and began following the tracks. Their search led them to a curve in the ravine, and around on the other side, old Pal was nibbling on the grass, standing tall, the saddle and the deer still on her back. She had received only minor scratches from this dangerous fall and was able to proceed down the mountain with the deer. Everyone made my father promise never to lend our horse to these friends again. Near Spanish Fork Canyon, the Spanish Fork River over the years had cut a deep and jagged pathway just before the river breaks out into what is known as the river bottoms. When I was a boy, it was my duty to herd sheep during the springtime in this area. One day I was riding old Pal and found myself on the other side of the river ravine. It was at least a half-hour's ride to a spot where the approaches to the river sloped gently enough to permit me to approach and cross the river on my horse. However, as I looked down the ravine, I saw right below me a large concrete pipe which carried irrigation water directly across the ravine to some canals on the other side. Since the pipe was six-sided, it provided a flat surface on the top about 2 feet wide. I also noticed that the approaches on each end of this pipe were accessible for a person on foot or on horseback. I sat there thinking, should I see if old Pal could walk across this concrete pipe and save me a half an hour ride up the river to find a normal crossing space? I never doubted that she would be able to successfully walk along this concrete pipe and take me to the other side. As I later reviewed this same situation in my mind as an adult, I decided that this was indeed a treacherous, dangerous, and foolhardy thing to do. This is what's called the maturing of wisdom. However, being 12 years old, full of confidence in my horse, I urged her upon the 2-foot wide flat surface of the concrete viaduct and calmly walked her to the other side of the chasm. Sometime later, I related this experience to my mother, who said, "Don't you ever do that again, Paul. You could be killed along with your horse." As I mentioned before, old Pal was always ready for a race, even against an automobile. My older brother Norman had just purchased his first car, a 1927 four-cylinder Chevrolet Coupe, and I challenged him to a race up to our farm, which was about a mile away. He was older, and of course he knew it was unrealistic for a horse to outrun a car for that distance, so he purposely kind of hung back in this race as old Pal and I flew down the road. At about a quarter of a mile mark, it was necessary for me to make a left turn. And as we made the turn in the gravel that had accumulated alongside this dirt road, old Pal's quickness either took her feet out from under her as she hit the gravel, or I fell off with the sharpness of the turn. I found myself slammed to the ground and thrown through this pile of gravel. I received numerous superficial wounds to my ankle, to my knee, my neck, and the entire side of my rib cage. I crawled to a grassy spot at the edge of the road and waited for someone to come and get me. Of course, the first to arrive was my horse, who smelled me up and down and stood patiently by until Norman was able to turn around and pick me up. He took me back home, and then Alden took me down to the Dr. Moody to have my wounds treated and the gravel removed. Norman stayed home to receive his lesson in older brother responsibility. Dr. Moody treated my wounds with a red antiseptic medication named methylate, which has a substantial stinging sensation when applied to open wounds. My brother Alden had retired to the local soda fountain to have an ice cream float. He could hear me screaming in pain from the doctor's office, which was about a block away. He decided that when the screaming stopped, I would be ready to go home. When all was quiet, he returned to the doctor's office to pick me up. The treatment of the scraped skin on my face, my rib cage, and legs convinced me that I should never race cars where you have to make sharp turns on a roadside full of gravel. The father of my first serious girlfriend was the owner of one of the local feed stores. Whenever it was not possible to borrow or otherwise acquire an automobile transportation, it was an easy thing to ride Old Pal and tie her up in the feed barn and visit my girlfriend. This was probably the last known incidence of courting on horseback in our town. I remember one exciting experience that my brother Snell had with Old Pal. An elk wandered down into the farmlands. Snell took off on Old Pal to chase the elk, jumping fences and ditches and finally giving up when Old Pal became wet and bathed in sweat. Although she was swift and sure-footed, she was no match for an adult elk. In addition to the memories I have of Old Pal, I have one picture of me about the age of 10 when I rode her in the 24th of July parade down Spanish Fork Main Street. I was dressed as Daniel Boone with a coonskin hat and frontier clothes. I had an ancient muzzle-loading musket and a bearskin complete with the head that was draped over my horse. I had a sign that read, "Daniel Boone killed a bar." I received first prize in that category for my depiction of this famous frontiersman. Old Pal was indeed a horse for all seasons and situations. She lived to be 29 years old, and I am looking forward to seeing her on the other side of the veil, where she and I can talk about all this again.